Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I'm really happy to be here and give this talk. Really nice of you to invite me. A little bit about myself. So my name is Eveline. I work at Jönköping University in Sweden. I have a master's degree in informatics with a specialization in user experience design. I work as a teacher at the university at the moment. I teach courses in human-computer interaction, in user experience design, and I also teach some courses in programming and web design. So quite a mix, but yeah, I really love it. But yeah, I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm going to talk about a paper that I wrote together with Bruce, who is an associate professor at the same university as me. Also Michaela, who then was a master's student at Johannes Kepler University in Austria, and also Marcus, who is a professor at that same university. So let's get started. The paper is called "I Don't Care How Popular You Are," quite catchy, investigating popularity bias in music recommendations from a user's perspective. And I will be talking a little bit about different concepts, recommender systems in general. You probably all already familiar with this, but I still want to make sure that we are all on the same page with what I'm talking about. Okay. So first of all, recommender systems. So we all know that they are implemented everywhere today. I bet there is not many people that use any type of online services that have managed to avoid these systems. And ultimately, we want the recommender systems to help us discover content that we want and also content that is good for us and that we need. And recommender systems have a very big impact on the content that we consume. And this can, of course, have both positive and negative effects depending on things like how fair the recommender system is. And so if a recommender system is unfair, this, of course, has a negative impact on us. So fairness is very important. And the fairness issue that we looked into in our study is very common with collaborative filtering. And so I just want to speak a little bit about what collaborative filtering is. So CF it's a common technique used for generating recommendations. So it makes recommendations to users based on behaviors of other users that have similar tastes. So you could say that it considers the interaction behaviors of other users with similar tastes to generate recommendations to the target user. It has limitations though. It can make unfair recommendations due to something that we call popularity bias. So it enhances popularity bias in many cases. And this is the fairness issue that we decided to look into in this work. So I've made a really nice visualization of popularity bias that I'm dying to share with you. So first of all, popular items get more interactions, right? So they are consumed more often, they get more ratings and so on. And this makes them get recommended more often. And again, they get more interactions, they get recommended more often, and so on. And then that makes us go into what we call the feedback loop. So they get more and more rich, these popular items. And if we take it and look at the less popular items, they don't get as much interactions naturally because they are not as popular. And then they don't get recommended as often. They have a much lower recommendation frequency. And then no loop for them, it stops here. And so when we speak about popularity bias, we often hear of the long tail phenomenon. And I borrowed a really nice and simple visualization from the normal Nielsen group that I think shows this nicely. So it shows the popularity distribution among items. We have the head and we have the long tail. So in the head, we have items that are very popular, they have a high recommendation frequency, and they are few in number. And usually they are mainstream. In the long tail, on the other hand, we have most of the items and they have a low recommendation frequency. So they are low impact, they are most commonly niche, many number, and not always, but sometimes obscure. And what happens here is few items get almost all the exposure. So then why is this a problem? First of all, users easily end up in a filter bubble that makes it hard for them to discover new or niche content. And also all users don't want popular items. So it makes it hard for them to get items that they want. Another key point is that popular does not equal high quality. So just because an item is very popular, it doesn't mean that it's a very good recommendation. And users may not get the recommendations that are best for them. That's the baseline here. There are other stakeholders that also suffer from this, in some cases even more, because few item providers or content creators, or what you want to call them, get almost all of the exposure. So if you're an item provider who is not very popular, you're starting out your business, this can really affect your career and your livelihood negatively. So to put it in simple terms, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So I want to talk a little bit about previous research, not in detail at all, but what we saw with previous research is that most studies focused on methods for improving algorithmic objective fairness. But the problem here is that this type of objective approach doesn't really take into account how users perceive popularity and fairness. Recommender systems can be fair from an algorithmic standpoint, but this does not imply that the recommender system is perceived as being fair by its users. And recommendations are created for users at the end of the day. So we thought, what about their perceptions? So in our study, we took on, you could say, a user-centric approach to understand how users perceive popularity and fairness in recommendations, something that we really hadn't seen much of before. So let's go through the research questions that we had and that we wanted to investigate for this study. First of all, we wanted to understand whether users observe a difference between common recommendation algorithms in terms of perceived popularity and fairness. Secondly, we wanted to know if perceived popularity correlates with objective measures of popularity bias. And when we talk about the objective measures here, we mean algorithmic measurements of popularity bias. So we wanted to see if there is a correlation there between the perceptions and the objective measures. The third question that we wanted to look into is if there are different or other factors that have an impact on perceived bias and fairness. And we decided to do this within the domain of music recommendations. So we decided to do an online study, and I built a platform for this. And we managed to recruit 170 participants, and we chose to work on Amazon MTurk, or to recruit from there. After we filtered out invalid and incomplete responses, we ended up with 115 responses that we could use. We had some requirements for the participants in the study. First of all, they needed to have a very good reputation on MTurk, and we defined very good reputation as at least 95% task approval rates and 1,000 approved tasks. So that was the baseline there. They also had, we had another requirement which made it a little bit more difficult to recruit. We needed them to have an active account on Last.fm, and there they needed to have a sufficient listening history, and we decided on at least 2,000 listening events. And if you're not familiar with Last.fm, it's an online music service that tracks the songs that the users are listening to on different platforms like Spotify, Deezer, and so on. And then they provide the users with music recommendations. The way that the study worked was like this. First, the participants got a description of the study, but they didn't get the full story. They were not informed about the entire purpose of the study. And this was because we wanted to avoid some bias, and we didn't want them to think too much about popularity and fairness going into the study. So instead of telling them everything, we described to them that we wanted to understand people's opinions on different personalized playlists. So still true, but not giving away all the details. Then the participants needed to enter their Last.fm handle, their username on Last.fm. And then we checked the number of listening events through the Last.fm API. And 3 different personalized recommendation lists were generated, and they were generated by 3 common collaborative filtering-based recommendation algorithms. And then the participants were answering first some demographics questions, and also some questions about the recommendation lists that they were shown. So I told you already that we had 3 recommendation lists, and these were displayed on separate pages, and they were also randomized. So we chose to display them on separate pages because we didn't want the participants to do any type of direct comparison. We wanted them to look at the lists in isolation. And we also randomized because we wanted to ensure that no specific order had any impact on the results. And then the participants answered the questions about each playlist. So I'm going to show you how the platform looked. So here we have an example of a playlist. And as you can see, we first have the song title displayed. We have the artist or artists. We also chose to display the genre. And then for each song, the participants had to answer whether they knew the song, whether they had listened to the song, and also if they thought that the song was popular or not. And if they answered that they didn't know the song, then the other 2 were disabled. So yeah, obviously, if you don't know the song, you can't really say if it's popular or not. And below the playlist on each page, we had these or not questions, we had statements. And so the participant had to answer these statements, whether they disagree or agree. And we used a 5-point Likert scale. We felt like 5-point would give enough granularity for this study. So first we had 3 statements on satisfaction. So I am satisfied with the list of recommended items. I would give the recommended items a high rating, and the list of recommendations matches my preferences. Then you can see we have a control question where the participant was supposed to answer just with disagree a little. And this is what we use to filter out these careless or invalid responses. And then we had 3 statements on perceived fairness. And if we look at these fairness statements, like the first one, it says this list has a good balance between popular and less popular items. The second one, the list would be more balanced if more popular items were included. And the last one also more balanced. So we didn't use the word fairness. And we did this because we thought it might introduce some type of bias. People interpret fairness in different ways. So balance was the word that we went for. We had different measures. So we measured familiarity, and this was measured by having the participants answering whether they knew the song or not, as I showed you in the previous slides. We also measured perceived popularity, and this was when they answered if they knew the song or not. Satisfaction, I showed you the statements that we used, and also the perceived fairness, which was measured by those 3 last statements. On the final page of the survey, we had a final question for the participants, and that was which item characteristics were used to determine the popularity of the item. So the popularity of the artist, the song, or the genre. And here they could tick multiple boxes. Yeah, but this was used to determine or to see how they determined if an item was popular or not, what they looked at. So let's talk a little bit about the algorithms. So we had some requirements for these algorithms that we chose. First of all, we needed them to be collaborative filtering based, which I've already talked about. These types of algorithms are prone to popularity bias. So that seemed appropriate. We also wanted them to be commonly used. And probably most importantly, they needed to have differences in their proneness to popularity bias. And this was, of course, to see if the participants could tell a difference between the recommendation algorithms. And if they don't vary in popularity bias, well, how can they tell a difference? We also needed the algorithms to be computationally efficient. This is because we needed to generate these lists quite fast. It was an online study, and we were worried that participants might terminate early if they needed to wait too long to start the survey. So this was a quite important requirement when we chose algorithms. So the ones that we chose to test was, first of all, multi-VAE, so a variational autoencoder. And this was the algorithm we had with the highest level of popularity bias. Then we had the sparse linear method, and this one was kind of in the middle. And then item KNN, which had the lowest proneness to popularity bias. So these were the ones that we worked with. And each of the algorithms was trained on a data set called LFM2B. And this data set consists of 2 billion listening events from Last.fm users. And then the recommendation lists were generated by feeding the trained model with the listening history that we fetched from Last.fm. I want to just briefly show you the popularity bias measurements that were used to determine the algorithmic popularity bias. I won't go into details on this because this was not my focus. I focused mainly on designing the study, so not these objective measurements. But all these measure the level of popularity bias for the algorithms. So let's move on to the actual results of the study, so the most interesting part. I want to remind you of the research questions and go through them one by one. So first of all, we wanted to know if the users could observe a difference between recommendation algorithms in terms of popularity and fairness. And the answer to this was no. So the participants didn't perceive any difference, not in popularity and not in fairness, between the three different algorithms. So even though they were different, no algorithm was perceived to be different in fairness or popularity. We also wanted to know if there was a correlation between perceived popularity and objective measures of popularity bias. And again, the answer was no. So the perceived popularity and the objective popularity of the recommended lists did not correlate. And then the final one, we wanted to know if there were any other factors that influence perceived bias and fairness, or any other factors out of the ones that we looked at. And here we got some quite interesting results. So there was no difference between the algorithms. There was no correlation between perceived popularity and objective popularity bias, but we did notice a trend for perceived fairness for the sparse linear method. So a higher number of less popular songs only contributed to a higher perceived fairness for SLIM, not with any other algorithm. We also saw that participants were more satisfied with the recommendation lists when their perception of them was that they were more fair. And this cut across for all of the algorithms. And this was quite interesting to see. At the same time, they were not more satisfied with the recommendation lists from any algorithm in particular. So even though they were more satisfied when they were more fair, they didn't prefer any algorithm. And we also saw that familiarity with songs influenced the perceived fairness for SLIM, but only for this algorithm. So this raises a couple of questions. And the first one would be, what was so different about SLIM? So we saw that a higher number of less popular songs contributed to higher perceived fairness. And familiarity with items also influenced the perceived fairness. So we did a manual inspection of the recommendation lists created by this algorithm. And a closer look showed that often they consisted of songs from the same artists. So if I see the same popular artists appear many times in a list, this could make me perceive the list as more unfair and the other way around. So this could influence the perceived fairness of the list, which could explain the result. This was also in line with how the participants determined popularity. They stated that artists play the biggest role when assessing popularity. So 80% actually said that. And the song and the genre were less important. So this could be the reason behind these different results for this algorithm. But I think the most interesting part of this study, at least in my opinion, was the relationship between satisfaction and perceived fairness. So as I told you, we saw that participants were more satisfied when they perceived the recommendation lists as more fair for all algorithms. So the question is, what do we do with this information now? So what we concluded was that this is really good news for artists, at least for less popular artists, because we could recommend less popular artists or items more often without compromising the satisfaction of the user. And not only not compromising the satisfaction, but actually increasing it. And as I mentioned in the beginning, new and less known artists, they suffer from popularity bias. And this could be a really strong argument for trying to mitigate it. And if the users are more satisfied with the recommendations and more item providers are satisfied with how the platform is treating them, so to say, then the platform also gains, because the platform, the service provider can retain its stakeholders, users and providers. There were some possible limitations to this study, as is with all studies. First of all, the algorithms may not have been different enough in terms of fairness. So if the algorithms were more extreme in their level of fairness, the difference may have been noticed. So maybe it could be something there to look into. Another limitation could actually be that the fairness statements did not include the term fairness. So if you remember, we had these statements in the survey and using the word balance. So we tried to mitigate bias by doing this, but maybe they didn't think about fairness. So the question would be if we measured the right construct. For future work, we think that this is a framework that can be used to investigate performance of many different algorithms, not just the ones that we decided on. And it would also be really interesting to test if these results apply to other recommended domains. So we focused on music, but it would be interesting to see if it holds true for movie recommenders, for example, or any other recommended domain. That's actually all for me. Thank you so much for listening.